I know that we pick on certain examples in the public sector where there are huge pensions, and indeed cabinet ministers are one of the main beneficiaries of them. But there are plenty of people in the public sector going to retire on very modest pensions.
Oh, yeah.
Why would we pick on them?
This should not be seen as an argument about the big so-called fat cats in the public sector at all, in my view. It might be symbolic and totemic, but it's not where the problem is. The problem is that in the past, and my dad was a probation officer, and I can remember when I was a kid, he used to say, the pay's lousy, but the pension's great. And what has happened, and he died some years ago, but Mum enjoys that pension now. What happens, of course, is that the last government really did do a good job in bringing public sector pay up, especially at the lower end. And there are still an awful lot of poorly paid people in the public sector, hundreds of thousands of them, but by the way, there are an awful lot of poorly paid people in the private sector. And what you've now got is the pay levels have gone up, a lot are equated with the private sector, but they're still enjoying the equivalent of my dad's pension. And we can't go on like this. And when in 2003, I think it was, or 4, this government gave in to their union paymasters and said, it's okay, you can carry on retiring at 60, don't worry about it, pal. I have to say, that was an awful day, because the world understands that in the developed economies, we have got to work longer. Hold on.
According to the TUC, the average pension in the public sector is less than 5,000 a year. Who's getting rich on that?
Oh, that's not the point. Individually, you're so right, and I'm sure that my learned friend here is going to say that. It's not that. There are hundreds of thousands of these people, and you can't do it. Especially when the private sector,
then? We just don't pay them
the private sector and pensioners.
Well, what are you proposing?
I'm proposing that they don't retire. They don't, wrong word, retire. They're not entitled to draw their public sector pension, because so many of them draw them and carry on working, remember. They're not entitled to draw their pension until 67, 68, and neither should the private sector. Well, but to tell them...
A lot of them might be about to be made unemployed.
Well, but to retire them at 60 is just... the nation can't afford it.
OK, Gail Cartmail, the Deputy Prime Minister says it's unfair and unsustainable. What do you say?
Well, I don't accept that, and it was the Liberals actually that brought in the state pension a century ago, and to penalise hard-working public sector workers when they have entered into agreements that have reformed their pension scheme. We've got cap and share, and cap and share means that employer contributions are capped and any risk is shared. But these figures that you are looking at today are falsely presented. It would be much more interesting to look at the Audit Office report. Yes, you could say, looking at these figures, it's doubled, but that's not looking at the situation over the longer term, and it's highly politicised. Digby's talked about gold-plated and trade union paymasters. The reforms that we introduced across civil service, teaching and the NHS have resulted in good risk sharing, and these figures are just being spun very politically.
Is it fair that somebody in the private sector and somebody in the public sector doing the same job at the same low pay level, and I accept there are a lot of low paid people in the public sector, I certainly do, is it fair that the taxpayer pays for one improved pension and the person in the private sector has had to take a reduction in what they're going to get? Is that fair?
Our members who are nurses,
let's take the emotion out of this.
Our members who are nurses
and teachers. Let's talk about somebody who's doing the same sort of job, and a low paid administrator.
Let's call them a tax inspector.
Yeah.
But there are many
emotive things about nurses.
Except you see, Digby,
never mind who it is. What's the answer to his question?
What's the answer to my question?
Well,
is it fair?
Is it fair that we have a race to the bottom? Is it fair that in the public sector, where pay typically has been lower than in the private sector,
that's not true.
That's not true anymore.
Is it fair that you have a race to the bottom?
Do you
want pension poverty?
Median pay is £1,400 a year more than the private sector.
65% of the public sector workforce are female. Most women suffer a gender pay gap in private and public sector. We attack their pension and we increase the gender. No, you're not, because you won't tackle gender pay gaps.
Well, that's another issue. I just want to stick to the pension issue for the moment. Your figure of 5,000 a year annually or less, you say 3,500 for women.
Half of NHS
does that
women.
include part-time workers?
Yes, it does.
So that does bring it down. For full-time workers, people who've worked in the public sector for a big chunk of their lives, they're going to retire on a pretty decent
sorry,
pension.
if I may just explain, the reason that over 50% of women in the National Health Service have a pension of about 3,500 is because they're part-timers.
That's part-time,
yes,
exactly. That's my point. So full-time workers are going to retire on a lot more than the figures that you're giving.
In fact, they may not be part-time now, but that's the
But
penalty
they would have been
have paid
for part
for
of
being
their
part-timers.
time. What is your take on this, Simon Hughes?
Well, firstly, can I say to Gail, I'm very conscious of the fact that we introduced the state pension as a party, and I'm very conscious, and I hope Gail recognises, that one of the things we brought to the coalition is that next year the pension will be increased, the state pension, to link with earnings again, abolished by the Tories. So we're very clear that pensions need to be looked after. The good thing...
So they should in the private sector too.
Yeah, well, they should, but the state...
And the last government destroyed private sector
but
pensions.
That was a commitment we made, and that's been going to be delivered. The good news for Gail is that this will be a deliberative process. We want the unions to be involved. You have very good points you make about the gender inequality, very good points you both make about the low pay of many people in the public sector. And Andrew, the answer has to be that we have to accept that there will be later retirement. That's the reality. That people shouldn't walk away with gold-plated pensions, including politicians, but that people on low pay in the public sector for whom we're responsible get a decent deal.
So Simon Hughes, can you let me if we're going to be doing all this, is it right that the people doing it, the ministers of this government, get a contribution to their salary of 26.8% of their salary, and that they can take their pensions, which are gold-plated by any definition, at the age of 55?
Well, Nick Clegg has made absolutely clear when he was in opposition, and continues to make clear, and Steve Webb, the pensions minister, made very clear, trying to get the House of Commons to change the rules to avoid that problem when we were in opposition.
Do you think that will change? Because these ministers, unlike most people when they retire in the public sector, they may do a little bit of work, but mostly their earning days are over. These ministers go on and become
Andrew,
directors of Goldman Sachs and on the board of big companies. They've got a ton of money still to earn. Why should they get pensions like that?
They shouldn't, and they won't. And I'm quite clear that we will not be able to continue that regime. And Nick has made that absolutely clear. You're right. It is unfair and unreasonable.
So you think it will change?
I believe it will change. I don't believe we can go out into the public place and argue that there should be huge protected pensions for people earning 100,000 and somebody retiring
you
off the
can't
salary.
expect. He talks about recognising the gender gap and about low pay in the public sector, which does still exist everywhere. Could I just suggest to you that you shouldn't have very high hopes of any of these things being changed in the next couple of years, when all the emphasis is going to be on cuts in public spending?
We are really...
I mean, it's not good, is it?
We're very, very interested indeed in being a part of the commission that's promised. And
well, you will be, won't you?
Have behaved very well. We don't know. We haven't seen any of the detail. But you know, again, in this conversation, the idea has been advanced that the normal pension age of the newly reformed schemes that we worked very hard to reform to make affordable is anything other than 65. The newly reformed schemes have a normal pension age of 65. So that's one thing that we have to lay to rest. And I would ask you this, I'd ask you all this.
This has to be the final point.
Yes, indeed. But would you want a paramedic or somebody doing a heavy, arduous, complex and demanding job to be working at 67, would you?
But just a minute, there's loads of people in the private sector who have to do that. And they don't get the ability for this conversation to take place. And nobody fights for them. Where I think you are so right, you should come on the commission.
We're the largest private sector union.
You should come on the commission and you should be there so that there's some buy-in here. But the day that the previous government said to your members, you can go, if you're today in work, you can go at 60, was an awful day for the economic future of this country.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I think we will be coming back to it. Come back and see us. Thank you.